So I just wanted to pose a beginning question for Elias, and which is, in a certain sense, the basic question. Why was this a genocide that Father Junipero Serra was right at the center of with these missions? And
after studying this for 7 years of research to put this all together, and this is irrefutable evidence. I didn't make it up. I went very carefully to look it up in other documents, books, talked to scholars in the end, and it's irrefutable. You can't deny it. It did happen. And your question, what made Serra do this? Well, Serra was, in all, as far as I'm concerned, was a monstrous guy. He was a madman. He was stuck in the 12th or 10th century, in the century of light, century of enlightenment, and were the new philosophies regarding human rights and the new forms of government were arising, and also were the divine rights of kings, where God placed a king and therefore he was under God and was all powerful, were being eroded. You know, no longer were kings in the 19th century as was when they were doomed. They were no longer considered gods on earth. He stated at one point that when he joined the Inquisition as one of the officials of the Inquisition, joined because he knew there were women and people, men, flying at night and going into isolated places and then doing evil deeds there. They were flying through the night. You know, the only thing he left out is that they were flying on broomsticks. This was the 18th century, the end of the 18th century, soon to be the 19th century. And that he felt that the Inquisition should have someone there to do its bidding. And he did. He accused one poor woman of doing just that, flying through the night. And he was simply not well read. He knew theology, which was 2,000 years old, but he knew the Bible very well and so forth, and Catholic dogma, brilliantly. But he wasn't up to what was happening in the 18th century. And on top of that, he held the same attitudes that the Spaniards had had in 200 years prior, when the Spaniards first came and discovered the New World. Well, Columbus discovered the New World, but they were quickly followed by a flood of conquistadores. And let me tell you about those conquistadores. In my mind, after reading up on them, they were nothing but loutish brutes. That's all they were, and they're glorified, but not in Mexico. Not in Mexico. You won't see any memorial to Cortez or Columbus publicly. And in fact, a cousin of mine who published a newspaper called, I think it was Proceso, had one cover, very good cover. I wish I should have brought it, I forgot. But it shows, it was on the anniversary, I think the 400th anniversary, or was it 1493? Yeah, I think it was the 500th anniversary of of Columbus's discovery of the New World. And it's just a beautiful example of what happened. It shows two hands shaking, like this, like that. One is obviously the Indians. They got some bracelets on their front. The other one is of the Spaniard, which is whiter, and it's got armor over here. And the handshake, the handshake of the conquistador is digging its fingernails into the Indian, and there's blood dripping out. He was a man that loved to beat himself bloody, maybe twice a week, with chains or a whip. Not the normal flagellation or what mortification is the correct word for it. What's more called the Catholic Church calls it mortification, and still sanctions it. That this is a good way to get closer to God. Not only did he beat himself bloody with this whip, but he also would take a flaming torch and then burn his chest with it, hold it against his chest, and then tear the burned flesh off. He was a very sick man. He needed a psychiatrist more and needed to be isolated, but that didn't happen to the church, all-powerful church. And let me tell you, the Catholic Church was very powerful because the Inquisition in the 18th century was still very strong. You want to get cast a Catholic Church, you were likely to be called before the Inquisition and put to the question, which meant torture. And that was not a pleasant thing to look forward to. So, just summing up Serra, he was a madman. He disobeyed the king's orders. The king's orders were to educate the California Indians for 10 years and then release them as full-fledged Spanish citizens with all rights, because the king wanted to establish very quickly a population that would represent Spain. And if all of a sudden people came there. And along the way, the king said nothing about cultural genocide. He just said, educate them, teach them how to read in Spanish. But then Galvez, the inspector general, who had been sent from Spain to make sure that the king's dominions were doing well, wrote a letter to Paolo, Friar Paolo, who was a good friend of Serra. And in that letter, he said, whatever you do, do not teach the Indians how to read or write. From experience, it hastens their ruination. Now, was that an order? Is that the reason that the friars didn't teach them how to read or write or Spanish or just even the basic knowledge of what was going on in the world? I don't think so. I think Serra already had it in his mind that his goal was to baptize as many Indians as he had for the glory of God. And if they died, well, so what? They went to heaven. That was a time for rejoicing, to cheer, and that's why Indians who were weeping over the deaths of a loved one in the missions were whipped. And there's a passage in here which talks about that, of one Indian who ran away because his wife and children had died and he was crying, and then he was whipped. So it was brutal, his attitude. He was the one that set the policies, followed by the missions, all 21 of them. Even after his death, they followed this. It was a disaster. It was disastrous, it was tragic, and it was bloody. The friars were twisted individuals. You all know what capos are? Do all of you know what a capo is? Yeah, well, do you know? No, okay. Capos were the Jewish bully boys in the Nazi concentration camps. The Nazis told them, do what you need, but keep your people under control. And do what you have to do. If you have to beat them or kill them, do that. And so the Serra set up a similar system in the missions, and he called them alcaldes, which in Spanish means a mayor. But they were not mayors. Or they called them capitanes, which means captains. And they were horrible to the Indians. They picked usually the Indians that were lazy, didn't follow orders right, it's because they knew that if they gave them power, they would rise to the occasion. And what resulted was their beating the Indians tremendously. And with little reason, they just pick some up and they would beat them. And that increased the death toll. During the reign of the missions, 62,000 Indians died in the missions. 62,000, that's a lot. They died of malnutrition, they died of depression, they died of diseases which they didn't have any immunity, like measles, mumps, influenza. They had totally new diseases that were strange to them. And then the friars decided, by God, we're going to keep these Indians pure. And by God, they did. They took all of the women, girls over 10 years old, unmarried girls, and every night they would lock them up. At each mission, they had a room called what they call a convento, which is Spanish for a convent. But there wasn't a convent, it was just a room with with pallets lining the walls. And the Indian women had to sleep there and maybe have a bucket or two for the restroom. And that was it. So you can imagine, these were not very big rooms either, very small. So one of those had a disease, it would spread like wildfire each night. People were other women were easily contaminated. They in turn contaminated other people. And then when Indians later, the friars decided, well, before they rebel, we need to let them go to visit their tribal villages for 2 weeks or a week. And so they would let them go. Many of those Indians from the missions were sick. They had been contaminated. And so they went to their villages, and you can imagine what happened. They contaminated everyone. Based on statistics, mission statistics, there were approximately 300,000, a little bit over 300,000 Indians in California on the coastal area. So by the 19th century, of 300,000 Indians, there were only 15,000 left. But in the missions, it was dismal is too kind of a word. It's too kind to describe what was happening there. They were death camps. They were death camps. Indians went there and they died. And finally, in 1820, a priest by the name, the last Spanish presidente, the director of all the missions, all 21 missions, a fellow by the name of Mariano Palleras, wrote a letter to his superior in Mexico City. And that's the smoking gun that shows very clearly and describes it very clearly that the friars were at fault for killing the Indians. He said, in this letter, and I'm paraphrasing, he says, we have to come up with an alibi, or else because of all the Indians that are dying. And we are going to be blamed for wiping out all of the Indians in California if we don't do something. All we have done for the Indians is to baptize them, administer the sacraments, and bury them. And that's exactly what was happening. He said, we have killed the Indians. There are no more Gentile Indians outside of the missions. There are none surviving. And this is a letter that the Vatican does not want released. The Vatican would like to keep this, but it's in my book. I found it. And who published it? The Franciscans published them in a book called The Writings of Mariano Palleras. Also, the writings of Junipero Serra, the writings of Lasuen. They're all of the correspondence. And I've got to give it to the Franciscans. They were very scholarly in printing. Even letters they knew were damaging. But they did.